For decades, history celebrated the end of the Third Reich as an inevitable victory. But if it hadn't been like that, and if, instead of falling, Germany would be crushed against its enemies one by one without lasting opposition? With all the power of the state, science converted into a tool of domination, and politics reduced to a mechanism of racial control, the Reich imposes its logic on the entire planet: obey, produce, call. What would it be like to live under a global Nazi empire in 2025? What happened with science and education, and how many of these dystopian ideas were more likely to occur than we thought? A distinct ending, the Reich changes the direction of history. The world recognizes May 8, 1945 as Victoria Day in Europe. The images of liberated Paris, the Allied flags waving over the ruins of Berlin, and the embraces between soldiers and civilians have been repeated for generations as a symbol of the triumph of liberation over tyranny. But history is a delicate structure full of decisions, errors, bad luck, and volontad. In a just different timeline, these flags never arrived. And with his absence, what was born was not peace, but silence beneath the boot. In June 1944, the turning point was not an Allied victory, but an unprecedented military tragedy. The Overlord operation, which in our history marked the beginning of the end of the Third Reich, became here the greatest logistical and tactical massacre of the 20th century. The German counterintelligence services, reinforced since 1942 with operations in Spain, Switzerland, and North Africa, managed to infiltrate Allied information channels. Documents, maps, codes, and schedules were replicated and sent back to Berlin. So, when the first American, British, and Canadian soldiers disembarked on the beaches of Normandy, they found no surprise but only fire. The beaches were fortified to levels never seen before. Numbers of camouflaged machine guns, long-range heavy artillery, and armored divisions stationed with surgical precision turned the French coast into a slaughterhouse. The paratroopers who descended during the early hours of the morning were intercepted by snipers who knew their landing routes. The first Allied tanks huddled in hidden steel traps beneath the arena. The engineers who tried to deactivate the obstacles were eliminated before touching the firm ground. In just 7 days, more than 200,000 Allied soldiers were killed or disappeared. Supplies accumulated over months were culled across the English Channel by German submarines in an operation that left the British coast vulnerable and demoralized. The images that arrived in London at the Liberation Show, with bodies floating between burned boats, the British press tried to minimize the disaster, but rumors and lists of disappeared people collapsed national morale. In Washington, the reaction was even more serious. Isolationist sectors in Congress demanded the cessation of operations in continental Europe. In parallel, the Eastern Front, traditionally exhausting for Germany, took a completely different turn. Hitler, advised by a less ideological and more pragmatic military leadership after the failure of 1941, decided to delay Operation Barbarossa for a year. This time, the Wehrmacht did not enter the blind in the Russian winter, come in equipped. The soldiers marched with thermal uniforms, guaranteed supply of synthetic fuel, climate-adapted ratios, and reinforced logistics lines for thousands of French and Yugoslav prisoners of war. The offensive began in the summer of 1942. Minsk fell within weeks, Smolensk in days. In fact, Moscow was surrounded. The Soviet capital fell after a combined operation of artillery, internal sabotage, and selective bombings. Stalin, weakened by internal divisions and health crisis, died in circumstances that were never clarified shortly afterwards. His corpse was buried in a country residence with no signs of fighting, but also no signs of humidity. His death left a void impossible to fill. Without a central figure or a clear chain of command, the Red Army fragmented into regional commands, many of which negotiated partial surrenders to avoid total collapse. In June 1943, a government puppet signed the Moscow Pact, recognizing German control over all the territory west of the Urals. The flag of the Reich waved over the Kremlin, and so the history of Soviet communism ended without organized resistance. In the United Kingdom, the effect of the Allied collapse was devastating. With Normandy lost and without the possibility of opening another front in France, the British forces fell closed on their islands. The Royal Navy, deprived of continental bases, could not contain the advance of German submarines that now patrolled even the North Atlantic. The Luftwaffe, reinforced with captured and improved aerospace technology, restarted a systematic campaign of bombings over industrial cities. Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Leeds, all were attacked with V-2 rockets launched from floating platforms located on the canal and from mobile bases in Normandy. The population, exhausted since 1939, collapsed emotionally. Churchill, symbol of resistance, was forced to resign in March 1945. The new government, led by a coalition of pragmatists and moderate nationalists, accepted an armistice with humiliating conditions: partial demilitarization, renunciation of its nuclear program, commercial opening towards the Reich, and transfer of several African colonies to German administration's provisionals. The United Kingdom became a neutralized island, his army reduced to defensive functions, his foreign policy limited by the surveillance of German diplomacy. The other key actor, the United States, will not intervene either. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler did not repeat the error of our history. I did not declare war on the Americans. It's a shame that Japan had faced Washington's naval and air power alone in the Pacific. This is the European war of North American public opinion. Roosevelt, even though I was willing to act, was constrained by an increasingly hostile Congress to become involved in recent conflicts. The industrial sectors were pressured to maintain their focus on Asia. Public opinion, frightened by the failure of Normandy, refused to open a new front. Without American soldiers in Europe, without disembarkation, without logistical support, without Soviet resistance, and with the United Kingdom surrendered, the continent fell to the hands of the Reich. France was reorganized as a protectorate since Vichy, with a collaborative government that administered metropolitan regions while the SS took charge of rural control. Poland and Ukraine were transformed into agricultural zones of systematic exploitation. The towns were displaced, the cities reorganized, lost children re-educated in German schools. The property transferred. Scandinavia, after years of occupation, was annexed directly as a Germanic territory. Finland, Sweden, and Norway lost all sovereignty. The Mediterranean, divided with Italy, became a strategic lake under joint control. Commercial routes to Africa and Asia were dominated from ports converted into fortresses: Marcella, Genoa, Tripoli, Thessaloniki. Nazi ideology, previously imposed by decree and violence, became a continental doctrine. The universities were purged. Departments of philosophy, sociology, comparative literature, psychology were closed. They only remained in the exact sciences if they were in the state service. The libraries were empty. The files will be rewritten. Partidos políticos fueron disueltos. Los unions prohibited. The press nationalized. The radios broadcast propaganda 24 hours a day. The cinemas alone projected documentaries about imperial achievements and films that glorified purity, duty, and obedience. Hitler, even alive in 1945, was elevated to an untouchable symbol. Jarno as a political leader, Bell as a mythological figure. Their portraits replaced the images of saints in reconverted churches. Statues were erected in all conquered capitals. Racial Purification Day was instituted as an obligatory festival. His voice, recorded in carefully edited speeches, was transmitted every dawn as an official greeting on the new day. And so the year 1945 ended. No liberation, no reconstruction, no hope. It's a bell for a Europe bound, disciplined and reorganized not by peace treaties but by the law of extermination and silence. There are no celebrations on the streets, only queues of displaced people, trains full of prisoners, cards with racial slogans, and factories working without rest in the service of an empire that does not need to justify its existence. The Semillas were still sembradas. The Reich on the ground had won the war. I had already read the report, the map, the language. I have the right to decide which part of humanity deserves to exist. The superpower of 2025, the global German Empire. 8 years later, the German Empire is not simply an expanded Germany. It is a new form of global organization that controls 4 continents and has redefined basic concepts such as sovereignty and citizenship. Europe does not exist as a mosaic of nations. From Lisbon to Vladivostok, the continent operates under direct or indirect German administration. National borders were blurred, replaced by efficient administrative divisions. France disappeared as a political entity in 1971. Paris, renamed Paris, serves as the Western administrative center. Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus were completely dismembered according to the general plan of the East. Warsaw does not exist. In its place is Weichselstadt, a German industrial complex. Western Russia was fragmented into puppet republics. Russian power was confined to Siberia without projection capacity. Scandinavia integrated itself as a natural Germanic territory, maintaining administrative autonomy but with foreign policy controlled from Berlin. Italy survives as a minor vassal state. Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria operate as nationalist republics that function as extensions of the Reich, maintaining the illusion of independence under subordinate constitutions. In Africa, the Reich restored its colonial presence with systematic brutality. The Reichskommissariat Africa manages from Morocco to Egypt. Namibia, Togo, and Cameroon function as resource and construction exploitation zones. Congo has become the world's leading supplier of lithium. Western Asia Lower Kayo gradually influences Germany. Iran, Iraq, Syria, and the Caucasus were economically subordinated through exclusive treaties. Afghanistan and India maintain nominal independence but are integrated into the German system through conditional loans and indirect military presence. Economically, the Reich absolutely dominates. Its GDP exceeds $12 billion, 3 times higher than China's. It controls 40% of the world's oil reserves, 60% of natural gas, 35% of rare minerals, and 45% of the most productive agricultural lands. The Reichsmark replaced the euro and other currencies after the strong unification. International transactions must be carried out in this currency, giving Berlin control over global trade. The economy operates between 3 sectors: white, Germanized zones with an advanced economy; gris, vassal countries with subordinate autonomy; and Negro, colonial regions that provide raw materials and slave labor. Reformed German corporations dominate entire sectors. IG Farben controls global chemistry and pharmaceuticals. Volkswagen Reich leads automotive production. Siemens Messerschmitt dominates technology and weapons. There are no independent unions. Labor conditions vary according to territorial racial classification. Militarily, the Reich maintains 850,000 active soldiers and 3 million in reserve. The modern Wehrmacht includes advanced land forces, transnational SS as political police, intercontinental nuclear missiles, and cybernetic divisions. A global network of bases allows you to project power in 48 hours to any point on the planet. United States falls confined to the Western Hemisphere. China never reached its potential due to German technological blockade. Japan maintains economic strength but subordinate foreign policy. Latin America suffers constant blackmail, with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as hotbeds of pressure against Washington. In 2025, Germany controls territories and resources on the ground. It controls the global narrative. Its media are the most influential. Its universities define the academic agenda. Its totalitarian model is presented as a guarantee of order and progress. Science without limits, technology under Nazi control. Knowledge was once the hope of humanity. Under the Reich, he became his most implacable chain. The Nazi victory on the ground redrawn frontiers, which also transformed the role of science. It went from being an engine of collective discovery to becoming a tool of dedication. In the absence of Allied liberation, without brain drain from America to the United Kingdom, Germany concentrated its hands on the most advanced physicists, biologists, mathematicians, and engineers on the planet. And with them, I built a dictatorship that on the ground dominated the present, which imposed the limits of the possible future. Science under the Reich does not enjoy freedom. It is directed, monitored, and controlled by the state. The Ministry of Science, based in Dresden, operates as a network of militarized research centers, where each researcher is at one time employed by the state and ideological property of the regime. The installations are closed, located in fortified rural areas or underground bunkers without civil access. No scientific person works without supervision. Your communications are monitored, your movements are restricted, and your publications are censored. Every discovery goes first through the State Utility Committee. If a formula, an idea, or an innovation does not strengthen the interests of the Reich, it is eliminated or confiscated. The attempt to defect, share information with the outside, or develop an unauthorized line of investigation is punished with disappearance. On scientific soil, also from his family, the punishment is symbolic and collective. It's a warning. Science has been tamed by terror. Germany produced its first atomic bomb in 1947 thanks to the work of Heisenberg, von Weizsäcker, and scientists forced to collaborate with the administration. With priority access to uranium from the Congo and graphite from Ukraine, and without Allied intervention, the Reich has in a few years developed a nuclear infrastructure that today encompasses land silos, strategic submarines, and mobile platforms. It was not a technical deception, but a political one. The message was clear. Knowledge was not emancipatory, but dominating. The space program followed the same logic. The Deutsche Raumfahrtbehörde, run from Vienna, manages dozens of military satellites, closed telecommunications systems, and orbital surveillance stations. Since the 1960s, the Reich has placed men in orbit. In the 70s, a lunar base was established. Even though these efforts are presented as civilizing hazards, their main function is control. Los satellites no exploran, espían. The orbital stations do not investigate the cosmos, monitoring the Earth. Under German protocols, internet, GPS, satellite television, and telecommunications were unified on a closed network. No country can use these services without signing an agreement on data transfer, content supervision, and technological compliance. If you don't know, you're disconnected. Digital isolation acts as a diplomatic sanction. No connection, no trade, no communication, no international existence. Countries that are not aligned disappear from the electronic map. The monopoly is even more oppressive in the biotechnological sphere. Without international regulations, and with absolute freedom to experiment on colonized populations, the Reich transformed its laboratories into population engineering centers. The vaccines went from being public health measures to becoming diplomatic weapons. Access to antibiotics, antivirals, or genetic therapies is conditioned on political obedience. A rebellious country faces shortages. An aligned country receives pharmaceuticals as a reward. Massive experiments are being carried out across territories in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Forced sterilization programs are applied in populations considered degenerate. Vaccination campaigns cover tests with modified viruses. Genetic manipulation seeks to create efficient working conditions, heat-resistant, with reduced sweat cycles, without reproductive capacity. They are functional human beings, but lacking autonomy. The German pharmaceutical industry does not compete, dominate. The Reich's medical companies do not operate as commercial actors, but as arms of the state. Its function is not profit, but control. Medicine licenses are organized according to the international conduct of each nation. A country can have its insulin production suspended if it votes against the Reich in an international body. Health was converted into blackmail. Scientific education is subject to the same logic. Universities are not spaces for debate. Each faculty responds to a state plan, where matters are not taught to think, but to obey. Students are selected according to ethnic origin, family history, and utility profile. Social sciences are prohibited. Philosophy was replaced by racial doctrine. Theoretical physics only teaches itself if it has military applications. Ethics was eliminated from the curriculum. It's not important, it's not true, it's just useful to the Reich. In colonial territories, the situation is even more brutal. Advanced scientific education is prohibited. You are taught how to operate machinery, maintain installations, or perform simple technical tasks. The objective is to prevent dominated populations from developing intellectual tools to resist. Knowledge is administered as a privilege, not as a right. And educational centers act as filters, not as scales. For decades, thousands of scientists have tried to escape. Some managed to reach America, Asia, or neutral enclaves and collaborate in clandestine networks of parallel investigation, but most of them were intercepted. The Scientific SS, a division specialized in academic surveillance, is responsible for detecting leaks, infiltrating laboratories, and eliminating all dissent in the field of knowledge. The stories of deserters end in symbolic executions, mysterious accidents, or unrecognized disappearances. There are no martyrs of knowledge, only silence. The patent system works as the final lock. The Reich decides which country can manufacture an engine, produce a fertilizer, or access a cure. Each invention is registered as property of the state. Anyone who uses it without permission commits technological piracy. And the sanctions are severe: commercial blockades, industrial sabotages, energy cuts. The patents became the Reich's most effective diplomatic weapon. A genetic formula can control a border. An oncological treatment can decide an election. The effects of this absolute domination are devastating. No other nation can fully develop. Vassal countries must ask for permission to innovate. Universities in the rest of the world are subject to curricula imposed by international agreements drafted in Berlin. Even scientific publications must pass through ideological filters. Citing a scientist expelled by the Reich could invalidate an investigation. Criticizing the Reich's technological policy means losing access to funds, data, and equipment. Countries that try to resist are marginalized from the world system. African, Latin American, or Asian researchers can only publish if they are affiliated with German centers or if they sign political neutrality clauses. The international awards are managed by foundations controlled directly or indirectly by the Reich. The image of global scientific advance is not real. It is a choreographed theater from which the script was written. Humanity, in this scenario, does not advance the freedom of knowledge, but has its absolute hierarchy. The Reich does not prevent knowing, but decides who knows, how much, how, and what for. In this control lies your true power, because it's not enough to conquer lands or discipline our bodies. Total mastery is only achieved when the mind, the method, the imagination are conquered. In 2025, Germany on the ground controls territories, armies, or coins. Control your knowledge. Control the development possibilities. It controls which illnesses can be cured, which technologies can be shared, which problems can be resolved. And above all, it controls the future, because every new idea must first pass through the permitted filter. There is no innovation without permission. There is no doubt without punishment. There is no alternative without punishment. The knowledge now seems to be a collective promise. In this world, it is a prison shaped like a library. An invisible genocide, the story that was never told. The Allied liberation of the Nazi camps in 1945 allowed us to document, judge, and remember the horror. But in this other world, I never reached liberation. No Nuremberg hub, no testimonios, no rest gates. The horns continue to run without interruption. The gas chambers were perfect. When he did not cry out to the victims, the Reich proceeded to erase even the memory of his existence. Between 1945 and 1970, the elimination program was systematic, industrial, and absolute. More than 120 million people were exterminated or enslaved. The 6 million Jews were killed before the end of the war, only at the beginning. They are joined by millions of survivors who will not escape in time. In less than 3 decades, the European Jewish population was completely eradicated. No synagogues, no genealogical archives, no schools, no cement institutions fell. The millennia of culture were eliminated from the continent as if they never existed. The extermination was racial, but also social, political, functional. 3 and 5 million Slavs, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians were systematically executed or reduced to perpetual slavery. Entire cities were vacated: Krakow, Kiev, Minsk, Prague. The houses were handed over to Bavarian, Prussian, or Swabian settlers. Lost children were ripped away from their families. Those who showed old characteristics were Germanized. The rest were sent to labor camps or gas chambers. Millions of young people became victims of a cultural, linguistic, and biological extinction program. On the ground, their communities were destroyed, their music was banned, their languages were buried, their collective memory was dismantled. The disabled were locked up in medical centers, where they were executed through injections, gas, or starvation. Political, religious, and homosexual prisoners were sent to industrial camps, from where no one returned. But not everyone was killed immediately. Millions were preserved as disposable labor units. The logic was clear. If extermination produced senescence, slavery generated wealth. A continental network of factories, mines, hydroelectric plants, and railway routes was designed where unpaid prisoners worked, monitored day and night, fed with minimal food to continue producing until it collapsed. System of labor castes coded by colors and numbers was instituted. The slaves were marked with alphanumeric tattoos and were assigned a specific uniform according to their function. Black, underground mining work. Red, heavy construction and railways. Grease, industrial manufacturing. Green, intensive agricultural work. Amarillo, domestic servitude for Reich officials. Blue, controlled reproduction and biological maintenance. In the factories of Breslavia, Ternopil, or Bakau, prisoners worked 18 hours a day, double shifts during the winters. Minimum failures were punished with gas. Deprivation would fuel exemplar execution. Each slave was state property of quantifiable value. When its productivity drops, it is eliminated and replaced. Performance statistics were analyzed weekly. Each body was a tool that had to be used until terminal wear. Slave women were used for reproductive or sexual tasks. In camps such as Vitebsk or Radom, there were pabellones called directed fertility units, where women were artificially embarrassed with the sperm of military soldiers or technicians. Children were raised without identity, indoctrinated from birth as workers or soldiers. Mothers rarely survived more than 5 reproductive cycles. If they were born after the 3rd birth, there would be medical complications. In the Austrian Alps, underground tunnels functioned as laboratories and extermination chambers simultaneously. In the Velichka salt mines, prisoners died without seeing the light of day. Methane gas and explosions were common. The annual survival rate was less than 7%. Each corpse was incinerated in collective fires located inside the mine itself. The cenizas were used as mixture in the cement of imperial roads. The system was so vast and efficient that the Reich's economy sustained itself slowly. Estimates indicate that by 1965, more than 40% of the Eastern Reich's infrastructure had been built by slaves. The steel, the carbon, the lithium, the cement, and the wheat from the East arrived in Berlin marked by blood. The Eastern Human Utilization Regulation, approved in 1953, legally codified the state's rights over conquered populations. Among its clauses are lifetime assignment of labor tasks without due to appeal, the legitimacy of physical elimination for low performance, the hereditary transmission of the condition of slavery, the legal impossibility of ascension or liberation, the validity of forced reproductive use as state policy. The civilized extinction was parallel to physical extermination. Education was abolished in enslaved areas. Los libros were confiscated. Speaking native languages was punished with mutilation. Naming children with non-German names is prohibited. Religious or cultural festivals were replaced by imperial days. In the soil, they sought to kill bodies, but to destroy enteric cultures. The objective was simple: disappear without leaving the hue. The genocide was exported. In France, the Maghreb Muslims were imprisoned in camps in Corsica and Algeria. In Italy, ethnic cleansing campaigns were resumed in Ethiopia. In Spain, national purification programs were established in Catalonia and the Basque Country, which required demonstrating 5 generations of Spanish purity to avoid deportation. In Argentina, cultural whitewashing plans financed by the Reich were implemented, with forced relocations and destruction of records of migrants in Europe. For the year 2025, the word Holocausto does not exist. The few records that survived were destroyed. The oral testimonies of the few survivors were silenced, discredited, or executed. There are no museums. There are no memorials. The official version written by the Ministry of Culture of the Reich speaks of demographic reorganization and sanitary solutions against degenerate populations. Filtered photographs are considered montages. The recovered letters, forgeries, human remains attributed to illnesses or regional wars. The generations born under the Reich do not know the other truth. They created an official history that presents the 20th century as the glorious era of purification and racial unification. The last real testigos, elders hidden in caves in the Caucasus or in underground communities in South America, transmit their memories as tales of terror. But these stories, devoid of material tests and institutional support, are considered myths, delusions, or foreign propaganda. Questioning the official version is a crime. Talking about genocide is a conspiracy. Teaching about past crimes is betrayal of the Reich. Teachers who insinuate other readings disappear. Books that mention extermination are incinerated. The memory was murdered together with the victims. Perfect crime was built. The most complete genocide in history was carried out on the ground, even though every possibility of remembering, reconstructing, or demanding justice was eliminated. In the hub, there are cameras recording the entry of Allied tanks. In the liberation hub of Auschwitz, there were testimonies like those of Primo Levi or Elia Wiesel. In the hub, there are monuments with engraved names. Only silence. Humanity in the year 2025 inhabits a planet where the greatest tragedy of its species has officially never occurred. The victims were blurred. los culpables, consecrated as architects of modern civilization, and history, as it is taught today in the schools of the Reich, does not have martyrs, solo winners. Controlled society, everyday life under the Reich in 2025. Everyday life under the Reich of 2025 is not marked by liberation or by individual progress, but by a total system of state social engineering whose objective is nothing other than to manufacture perfectly obedient, productive, and racially homogeneous human beings. The individual does not exist as a subject of rights, but as a biological engine of an ideological machine. The Reich is not limited to dominating the present. It has designed a society that makes it impossible to imagine any other future. The German language is the only legal language in all territories under German control, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Linguistic diversity has been systematically eradicated. French, Polish, Ukrainian, Czech, and Yiddish were eliminated from public space by decree. Labeling, signage, media, education, and communications are regulated in standard German. Speaking another language out loud can be considered a linguistic offense and leads to fines, arrest, or in repeat cases, hospitalization in language re-education centers. Homes are monitored spaces. Hidden microphones in household appliances, lamps, or electric meters collect fragments of domestic conversations. The objective is not just to detect differences, but to shape behaviors from childhood. Inadequate phrases such as extraño a mi lengua or I want to emigrate are registered, analyzed, and sent to the local social behavior committee. Loyalty is expressed in silences, in omissions, in the way in which a child betrays his parents. Education is completely controlled by the Ministerio del Pueblo. Since 3 years, children have entered the Reichserziehung system, which structures each formative stage as a chain of ideological assembly. For 6 years, I have memorized the blood oath to the German nation and participated in basic military exercises. Critical reading is prohibited. There is no international literature. Children's stories exalt purity, duty, and heroic heroism. The game is regulated and supervised. Civil simulation games are prohibited. He only allows himself to play war, surveillance, or the construction of the Reich. Biology teaching focuses on demonstrating the genetic superiority of the river. Historical experiments are presented in which human races are compared according to productivity, resistance to pain, fertility, and emotional stability. In history classes, it is taught that Europe was saved by the German genius. The books glorify figures like Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, and Goering as eternal builders of order, even as Allied, Jewish, Slavic, or African figures appear as traitors, degenerates, or biological threats. Education is not the same for everyone. Since the first few years, students have been classified according to a genetic code and family history. Only those considered pure access higher-level schools where they train in science, politics, strategy, or imperial administration. Children of mixed origin, tolerated minorities, or politically unstable families are assigned to labor education centers where they learn simple skills, technical obedience, and social surveillance disciplines. Access to the university is restricted to 4% of the population. To join, it is necessary to demonstrate intergenerational loyalty to the Reich, genetic purity without documented deviations in at least 3 generations, and academic records without ideological inconsistencies. Universities are not debate centers, they are state board factories. Philosophy is not taught, sociology is prohibited. The economy is limited to national authority manuals. The knowledge is only valid if it supports the stability of the system. The woman was reduced to her reproductive function. Advances in women's rights were completely abolished. The Office for National Reproduction assigns couples according to racial compatibility and medical antecedents. The women who fulfilled the standards of the demographic expansion program received birth decorations, preferential housing, access to better quality food, and public honors. Those who do not pass genetic tests are obligatorily sterilized or assigned to secondary roles. Working outside the home is prohibited except in specific areas that are always subordinate to the state: nursing, female teaching, domestic administration, or institutional cooking. Women's suffrage was annulled. Women cannot possess property, open bank accounts, or access interregional transport without the formal authorization of their peer, priest, or state guardian. The law punishes feminism as a degenerate doctrine, even though female homosexuality is considered a betrayal of a woman's biological mission. Contraception is penalized with imprisonment. The religious system was completely absorbed by the party. Traditional Christianity was reformulated in the Iglesia del Reich, an organization controlled by the state that preaches obedience to the Führer as a divine mandate. The cult of sacrifice and imperial destiny replaced the lessons of compassion. Each sermon requires prior state authorization and is supervised by liturgical culture officials. Parish priests must be active members of the party. Those who preach values such as equality or mercy can be arrested by infiltration of degenerate Judeo-Christian concepts. Non-Christian religions were systematically eradicated. Islam was declared illegal since 1951. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and indigenous spiritual traditions were eliminated from public records and their temples destroyed or converted into party workshops. Practicing any unauthorized rite implies immediate deportation, forced labor, or public symbolic execution. Art became the subject of propaganda. There is no free expression. The solo painting represents Germanic landscapes, portraits of soldiers, or imperial iconography. The music was reduced to martial marches, racial hymns, and symphonic compositions approved by the Central Aesthetic Committee. Wagner is the only classical author allowed. Jazz, rock, electronic music, or any Afro-cultural rhythm was prohibited by law. The film responds to Leni Riefenstahl's model, exaltation of the Aryan body, the imperial victories, and the eternal greatness of the Reich. Writers work under the responsibility of the Ministry of Culture. Each novel, poem, or script must promote values of obedience, honor, self-sacrifice, or civic vigilance. Satire is banned. Social criticism is a crime. Foreign literature was destroyed or rewritten to fit into the official narrative. Shakespeare was reinterpreted as a Germanic poet. Cervantes was excluded due to cultural degeneration. Einstein was erased from physics books. Freud was called the biological enemy of the Aryan soul. Surveillance defines private life. Each building has a Verbindungsoffizier, party liaison officer, in charge of collecting complaints, recording suspicious habits, and reporting conduct anomalies. Sometimes they receive economic incentives for reporting extraneous activities, a cheap conversation, an unauthorized book, an unexpected visit. Chambers without official branding monitor public spaces, stations, schools, work centers. Personal electronic devices are serviced from the factory. Each message sent is copied to central servers in Berlin. Access to employment, housing, and mobility is regulated by the Social Purity Index, IPS, a numerical classification that is assigned to each citizen at birth and which fluctuates according to their family history, their genetic health, their political participation, and their imperial merits. A qualification lower than 65 points prevents access to interregional transport, urban housing, or parental permission. Under 50, the individual is considered to be in a state of national disability and is forcibly reassigned to rural fields or collective factories. Society is structured around three immutable castes: leading caste, formed by military officers, institutional scientists, and party officials; productive caste, made up of technicians, workers, farmers, and state employees considered racially acceptable; tolerated caste, which includes conquered towns without citizenship and rights, is useful only as a work hand or controlled reproductive population. There is no mobility between castes. Mixed marriages are prohibited. Changes between regions require permissions. Professional promotion does not depend on talent, but on talent and loyalty. In this system, liberty is not a right, but a heresy remembered with shame. Every gesture, word, thought, or emotion must align with the official dogma. There is no spontaneity, no irony, no doubt. Society does not evolve, it does not debate, it does not create. It only obeys, preserves itself, and reproduces itself under an absolute orthodoxy. The Reich on the ground controls the present. Control the limits of what is thinkable. Control your questions, permitted words, prohibited questions. Control what your subjects can imagine about the future. At the edge of the abyss, the permanent Cold War. The planet of 2025 lives in a fragile global balance, dominated by two irreconcilable blocs. The United States, entrenched in the Western Hemisphere as the only majority democracy, and the German Reich, Converted into an authoritarian superpower that controls vast territories in Europe, Asia, and Africa. There are no open fights between them, but there is no peace either. What exists is a permanent tension, a global Cold War that determines every political, economic, and cultural decision in the world. After its total victory in Europe and Eurasia, the Reich imposed a new world order based on ideological isolation, territorial control, and economic exclusion. In response, the United States consolidated a system of alliances with Latin America, Oceania, and some parts of Asia. Since then, both blocs have competed for global influence through sanctions, embargoes, diplomatic sabotage, and veiled threats, but never crossed the line of direct confrontation. In this context, the economy became the main battlefield. The Reich, with absolute control of the European continent, applies systematic sanctions to any country that maintains commercial relations with the United States. Governments of countries such as Greece, Serbia, Morocco, or Iran are forced to reject North American investments under threat of isolation, confiscation of assets, or cuts in energy supply. Germany imposes what it calls forced economic neutrality, a policy for which old or dependent states must commit themselves by treaty to not allow bases, technological agreements, or financial agreements with Washington. Romania, Hungary, Tunisia, or Azerbaijan have signed these pacts under pressure. In exchange, they receive humanitarian aid, subsidized wheat, and limited access to the German market, which keeps them economically tied to Berlin. The Reich also blocks maritime trade with countries considered hostile. Ships coming from Mexico, Canada, or Japan face restrictions when crossing the Mediterranean, the Baltic, or the Black Sea. Some charges are detained under accusations of smuggling subversive ideas or collaboration with decadent powers. International ships, fearful of reprisals, choose to avoid routes that cross areas of German influence. The United States responds with its own sanctions system. It freezes assets of companies linked to the Reich in Latin American banks, prevents access to the dollar in international transactions, and promotes multilateral blocs on countries that sell strategic resources to Germany. Ecuador, for example, was excluded from the Inter-American financing system after signing a mining export agreement with Weichselstahl, a corporation controlled by the economic SS. The battle for resources is constant. Germany, which controls 60% of African lithium and a large part of Central Asian uranium, is threatening to limit exports to any country that participates in summits organized by Washington. Chile and Peru, trapped by both blocs, face constant boycotts if they decide to sell to one or the other. The control of raw materials becomes a currency of power, and the countries of the Global South are the main pawns in this field. Advertising is another key tool. While the Reich promotes its model as an example of order, discipline, and growth without corruption, the United States exalts freedom, consumption, and individual rights. Each bloc finances radio stations, periodicals, universities, and cultural centers in neutral countries to influence new generations. Western Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Balkans are particularly disputed areas. In Latin America, German influence has grown through bilateral agreements with nationalist regimes. In countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, or Bolivia, the Reich finances infrastructure, offers conventional weapons and trains employees in German political academies. Washington, for its part, supports allied governments in Colombia, Chile, and Brazil with defense programs, university scholarships, and preferential access to markets. Both blocs maintained parallel diplomatic networks. Instead of crusade embassies, they use third countries as intermediaries. Switzerland represents the interests of Germany in Washington. Uruguay does its own thing with EEUU in Berlin. Tensions are constant. Expulsions of diplomats, administrative sabotages, and rupture of agreements are frequent. The nuclear race is the main brake for direct clicking. Both blocs are aware of strategic heads in a state of constant alert. But the real terror comes from shared knowledge. A miscalculation, a false alarm, or a poorly managed climb could mean the end of civilization. Diplomatic crises happen year after year. In 2012, Germany blocked trade with Sweden following a logistics agreement with the United States. In 2017, Washington applied sanctions to the port of Alejandría for receiving shipments of prohibited technology. In 2020, Finland eventually became the trigger for a total confrontation by declaring its intention to break the neutrality treaty. Only Switzerland's urgent intervention managed to prevent the collapse of diplomatic channels. In each country, the cost of the Cold War is visible. Families divided, companies broken by restrictions, universities that must choose which books to teach and which to censor according to the dominant blockade. Citizens do not live in war, but they live in fear. I fear talking, importing, choosing an alliance badly. I fear falling between the giants, unable to give way. The balance of terror does not depend on the will for peace, but rather on fear or collapse. And this fear has sustained the world for 8 decades. None of the blocs want to be the first to break, nor the first to give ground. Each treaty is interpreted as weakness. Each gesture of dialogue is responded to with specificity. Humanity does not live in war, but it also lives in freedom. The Cold War has not ended. Solo has changed shape. The victory that was often real when the story ended in death. The dystopia explored is not speculative fantasy. As terrifying as it may seem, I am dangerously close to becoming reality. The Third Reich was an extraordinarily effective machinery that was only defeated through unprecedented sacrifices and critical strategic errors. The biggest Nazi mistake was to open a second massive front without consolidating the West. The Barbarossa operation of June 1941 against the USSR, although initially meteoric with millions of captured Soviets, turned into a logistical nightmare. The Wehrmacht did not conquer Moscow before the winter and destroyed the Red Army completely. The Russian winter, systematically underestimated, paralyzed German troops without adequate equipment. Miles were frozen due to lack of thermal clothing and fuel. The blitzkrieg that operated in Poland and France could not sustain itself in a territory so vast and populated. This decision fatally divided the Reich's resources. While fighting against Stalin, they had to keep Western Europe occupied, support the North African front, control the Balkans, and defend the Atlantic coasts. This dispersion weakened the offensive capacity and allowed Allied reorganization. If Hitler had consolidated Western Europe before attacking the USSR and achieved a quick victory in Moscow before the winter of 1941, history would have taken a different path. Energy dependence was a critical Achilles heel. Germany lacked its own oil reserves, depending on imports or the conquest of external sources. The main hope was to conquer Caucasian fields, especially Baku. But the southern offensive, culminating in the catastrophic Stalingrad, was an absolute disaster that marked the collapse of the Eastern Front. While the Allies had abundant access, self-sufficient United States, USSR with Siberian reserves, Great Britain controlling routes to the Middle East, the Germans began to suffer shortages that limited movement and effectiveness. Without constant energy, the capacity for prolonged warfare became unsustainable. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler made the most self-destructive decision, voluntarily declaring war on the United States, a nation with a population 3 times greater, unlimited resources, an expansive industry, and no divisive internal fronts. Until that moment, the United States provided Allied war material, but was not militarily committed in Europe. By declaring war, Hitler united American opinion against Germany and activated the most advanced industrial power in the world. The United States contributed millions of soldiers, massive equipment, financed Allied reconstruction, and created air-naval supremacy that would defeat the EJ. The American productive capacity was overwhelming. It produced boats, planes, tanks, and ammunition at a pace that Germany could not match. Its territory was beyond German reach, allowing production without interruptions. If Germany had avoided this unnecessary conflict, allowing Japan to fight solo against the United States, the European war could have ended differently. Hitler seriously underestimated the resistance of conquered towns. Count on whether the populations accept the new order quickly. However, resistance movements in France, Yugoslavia, Poland, and Greece were vital to delay operations, sabotage infrastructure, and provide Allied intelligence. Partisans systematically destroyed railways and depots, ambushed patrols, attacked officers, and demoralized occupants. Each local attack required reprisals and deployments that drained resources needed on other fronts. In the USSR, the civil population united massively in the defensive effort. Without this massive resistance, or with more effective repression from the beginning, the Reich could have consolidated territorial control more quickly. The Nazi economy operated through the systematic looting of occupied countries, forced exploitation, and violent accumulation of existing resources. This parasitic model had structural limits. The longer the war lasted, the more costly its administration was. German production could not compete on a long-term basis with massive American manufacturing and Soviet centralized planning. Allied bombings on major German industrial cities progressively destroyed the military infrastructure. As the defeats intensified, the economy began to shrink. Inflation, severe rationing, and the black market expanded. Civil morality collapsed when the promises of prosperity dissolved into darkness, repression, and fear. The Third Reich was not a cohesive regime. Even though Hitler maintained indisputable authority, his surroundings were plagued with internal struggles, contradictory ambitions, and administrative chaos. Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, and Bormann were constantly competing, sabotaging each other and duplicating efforts inefficiently. The structure does not favor efficiency or rational decisions. It depended completely on Hitler's charisma and impulsive decisions, without a clear chain of command or agreed strategies. Improvisation, bureaucratic duplication, and irrational decisions were symptoms of a dysfunctional dictatorship that wasted opportunities. A more technical and coordinated leader would have significantly greater possibilities. But the cult of the Führer destroyed all intelligent adaptation to changing circumstances. The scenario presented, victorious Germany dominating a fascist world, was not a remote possibility. The story depends on individual decisions, calculation errors, and accidental factors. At multiple moments between 1940 to 1942, Nazi victory seemed inevitable to contemporary observers. Remember this proximity in abstract academic exercise. It is an urgent call to understand how authoritarian systems can grow and consolidate, how democracies can fail out of complacency, and how freedom requires active defense, on the ground retrospective celebration. Democracy is not the natural state of human societies. It is a fragile achievement that requires constant vigilance, active citizen participation, and a willingness to resist when institutions are threatened by authoritarian forces. The world described reminds us that history has no predetermined meaning to progress. The values of human dignity, cultural diversity, and individual freedom that we consider fundamental can be destroyed if we do not protect them with determination. In 1942, when the Reich controlled from the Atlantic to the Volga, his victory seemed inevitable for millions. Only an extraordinary conjunction of popular resistance, German strategic errors, unexpected alliances, and heroic sacrifices prevented this alternative reality from being converted into our present. The history we know, where Nazism was defeated and democratic values survived, was not inevitable. It was the result of conscious decisions, specific fights, and the refusal of millions to accept a world dominated by racial oppression and totalitarianism. This analysis does not seek to generate pessimism about the fragility of civilization, but to remind us that each generation must actively choose what type of world it wants to inhabit and defend. Freedom is not preserved by inertia. It is gained and protected through conscious action and permanent commitment to values that make human dignity possible. The future is not predetermined. As we demonstrate the real history of the Second World War, individual and collective decisions can change the destiny of humanity. The responsibility for building a fairer and freer world continues to be ours every day. The distance between our reality and the nightmare described was terribly short. This proximity should serve us as a permanent warning. The horrors of totalitarianism are not relics of the past, but latent possibilities that require eternal vigilance. Because in history, as in life, seemingly small decisions can have monumental consequences. And there is a difference between freedom and slavery, between dignity and oppression, between light and darkness. Often decisions are made in moments that seem ordinary, but are definitive for the destiny of humanity.